let me make sure that we're recording this, and I can admit Marcia. And so today, introduction and a kind of an overview of the whole of Revelation, which I think is important because that gives us the framework within which to dive in individually. And then in the next 6 weeks, we're going to look at, we're going to work our way through the book. So next week is chapter 1, and we're only going to do chapter 1 next week so that we can do a kind of a deep dive. After that, there are 7 letters in Revelation, and we'll look at those the following week. And then a couple, and then the liturgy of the heavenly court, which has an awful lot of important theology and groundwork in it. And then it's going to get juicy in the middle of July. So on July 19th, we will start the first cycle of visions within the vision, and then the second cycle on July 26th. And then we'll wrap up with God's City, which are the last 2 chapters. I didn't put that in there, but that's the plan. So the last couple of chapters on August 2nd. So part of what inspired this is that 2020 has been quite a year. Maybe you've noticed. Yeah. So is this the end of the world? Probably not. There have been Christians reading Revelation for 1900 years and seeing in it the blueprint for the end of the world, which was going to happen in the 2nd century. Didn't. Then it was going to happen in the 4th century and didn't, and on and on and on and on and on several times until finally the end of the world really came in 999. Because it was going to turn to 1000. And it was like Y1K. But it didn't end. Nor at Y2K, nor at any number of other places along the way. And so, yeah, times are weird right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're at the end. We are probably not. So, but Revelation can give us a vision. A 2020 vision. And I want to start by emphasizing just the title. It's amazing, even this week, how many questions and emails I got asking me for the study of Revelations. And I'm sorry to disappoint all of you, but I've only got one. Just one revelation, which is the name of this last book of the New Testament. It's not plural, it's singular. And I think that is an important point to keep in mind, because we need to treat the book as a unified whole and not as a series, if that makes sense, right? It's one story, it's one God, it's one vision. It plays out in all kinds of different ways and different images and pictures, but it is one vision for God's people. And so it's Revelation. It is also, by way of warning, it is visually rich. This is a kind of pre-Hollywood blockbuster, this book. And please remember that this is written to be read aloud during worship in Western Turkey. What the book calls Asia is really kind of the western end of Turkey. And 7 cities within Western Turkey are the now Turkey are the addressees of this book. But it is intended to be read during worship. with no pictures, with no PowerPoint, with no accompanying video, because all of that is stuff that we're used to, but was not within ancient capability. So you have an audience tuned to hear like some of us were growing up listening to the radio. Do you remember that? I had the transistor, you know, by my pillow, and I got to listen to Vin Scully's Spin Dodger games. Others got to hear about the Green Hornet and other radio dramas. Think of Revelation as a radio drama that would be orally told during worship. And so it has a certain fantastic quality to it, and it invites your imagination and seeing what's happening in your mind. Although it also defies you being able to do that, because some of the pictures are impossible to draw, and there's too much going on. And so it is not just two-dimensional, and it is also dreamlike in a way. It's not linear, and it's not literal. And so one of the classic mistakes for Christians of many ages is to try to translate Revelation as the coded blueprint for history, or for the end of history. That we just need to decode God's architecture or plan for the end of history. It doesn't work that way. So it is not linear. It is not like a story that has the beginning and the middle and the end, and it starts here and it goes there, kind of like your day goes from morning to afternoon to evening. It bounces around. And so you have to sort of suspend, if you possibly can, your idea of time. So when bowls are released after seals are opened, they're not building upon the seals. They are representing what has happened in a different way. And so it's a completely different picture of the same thing. So it is more of art gallery than it is of story. And so you kind of have to put it's really right brain artistic stuff. So I apologize now to all of the architects and the scientists, because this could be frustrating for you. But it might also push you a little bit. So imagination is necessary, and it's I have in here faith as visio, a way of seeing. One of the ways that we think about faith is that it is a way of seeing the world. And so Revelation wants to unveil, reveal, unhide something, so that we can see the present within a bigger picture of God's eternity. That's kind of what we're going after here. Let's skip here. So to my point about art here, back to this. I found this mural in Spokane, Washington last year. And you see that life is a puzzle that can't be solved, so make it beautiful. Revelation is kind of like this mural. There is a long history of trying to turn it into a jigsaw puzzle of the future, and it looks kind of like this. It doesn't work. it doesn't fit. You can't sort of jam it into a box. It's plenty of colors and plenty of squiggly lines and things on top of each other, and it's more than two-dimensional. And I have said that studying Revelation to try to figure out what will happen at the end of the world and God's step-by-step plan for it is kind of like studying human anatomy with a Picasso painting. You're gonna get frustrated. It's not the best, diagram for surgeons. And it's going to frustrate you. It's going to frustrate you because because you come to one of two conclusions. Either one, the human body really doesn't look like I think it does, or two, this idiot couldn't draw. And the truth is actually something completely different. He was conveying something completely else, and doing a completely different sort of genre. So this Revelation is left brain, artistic, fantastic imagery with lots of different layers and lots of different meanings, and not very linear. So just know that going in. So Revelation's kind of a puzzle, and it invites some questions. And one of those is it canonical? Canon, C-A-N-O-N, only two N's, not three. Canon is actually a measuring stick, an ancient measuring stick. And so the canon is a word we use for the Bible, which books measure up and are worthy of being scripture. So the question is, should Revelation be in the Bible? Is it biblical? Is it trustworthy? Is it understandable? Is it useful? I'll invite you guys to jump in and think about that in the next few weeks. Would you include Revelation in the Bible? Let's study it and see. As early as the 2nd century, Montanus had determined through his careful study that the New Jerusalem was about to descend in Pepuza. It didn't. But what his prediction did, was set off a whole conversation and debate across the early church about whether this book is too dangerous to be included. And it brings up, it excites people, and it inspires false hopes, and should it even be included? And so Eusebius in the 4th century, who was getting really close to and very involved in sort of setting the list, which books belong in the Bible, which don't. That was a 400-year process. Eusebius had 3 categories. There were the accepted books and the rejected books and the disputed books. Well, Revelation was on the disputed list. It was, of course, included. But then 1,000 years later, when you get to a lot of the key Protestant reformers, they weren't so sure either. Luther made fun of the name of Revelation because he's saying it doesn't reveal anything. Why do you call it that? Zwingli called it no biblical book. And John Calvin, in his earnest way, wrote commentaries on every book of the New Testament, all 26 of them, but not Revelation. He didn't include it. in his set of commentaries because he just didn't think it was all that helpful. Of course, throughout history, many have questioned whether it is trustworthy or not. And one of the main reasons is that the Christ of Revelation and the God of Revelation do not match and are not compatible with the Jesus of the Gospels. There's not a lot about Jesus' historical ministry in there. Of course, there isn't in Paul either. But the violence in particular, all of the death and the bloodshed and the mayhem and the havoc that God unleashes out of heaven do not match the God revealed in Jesus Christ in the Gospels. And so it is so different, including so violent, that a lot of people have said, is this really trustworthy Christian literature? How do we understand it? A great quote from a bishop here. Let's read this together from the 3rd century. Dionysius said, "For though I do not understand, yet I suspect that some deeper sense is enveloped in these words. And these I do not measure and judge
by my private
reasons, but allowing more to faith. I have regarded them as too lofty to be comprehended by me. And those things which I do not understand, I do not reject, but I wonder the more that I cannot comprehend." As a bishop, he doesn't know what's going on either. So, the author of 2 Timothy says that all scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient and equipped for every good work. Is revelation useful? Does it help? Does it measure up? So I leave those questions with you to think about as we go through it this summer. Of course, the question becomes, how do we read it? Everything is interpreted. And even the idea that there is one meaning and you're supposed to get it right and interpret it this way is in fact an interpretation. And so the question is not whether you're going to interpret it, the question is how. Classically, there were 4 ways. Oops, sorry, let me go back. Ooh, hang on, oh, shoot. Hang on a second, let me go back. Thank you for your patience with the pastor. There we go. No. There we go. Classically, there were 4 ways to interpret scripture. Literally, Jesus walked home. That's not a scripture verse, I just made that up. Or just Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. So he cried tears. The literal interpretation is water leaked out of his eyes. And that's actually a legitimate interpretation of that. You can do a moral interpretation of that, which is to talk about how we all need to be compassionate and loving and of other people to the point that it moves us deeply because look, Jesus did, so we should too. You can do it allegorically, that those tears actually mean baptism or something like that. And then there's the anagogical interpretation, which is another whole level of that, but that is the sort of mystical interpretation. And that is hidden. That is where meaning is hidden in the depths of God's heart, and God may or may not reveal to us what it means. Why Jesus was crying was because of the way that creation was failing to respond to the Creator. John probably had that in mind when he said Jesus wept, because he also makes a point of saying that he saw how people were not getting what he was trying to say, and so maybe he is weeping for a loss of understanding, but he is also weeping because his friend Mary is weeping, and because there is death and there is sadness. And so these interpretation levels are not mutually exclusive, but you can see the distinction between them. There's the literal, there's a moral, there's an allegorical, there's an anagogical. Modern times have laid on a couple of other levels to this, which is, an infallible interpretation and a historical critical interpretation. So the infallible interpretation is the Bible said it, I believe it, that settles it. God wouldn't lie. And so if it says that the beast comes out of the lake with 7 heads and 10 horns, then in fact the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns, and you can count them all, and that's exactly what it looks like, and don't question it. The problem, of course, is that Scripture contradicts itself on some details, and so you paint yourself into a box that you can't get out of with that interpretation. We also now look at things historically, critically. The infallible interpretation of Jesus wept is Jesus wept. And if you don't believe it, you're calling God a liar and you're in trouble. Historically, critically, did Jewish men weep at funerals? Why was he doing that? And what did it mean socially, and what were the implications of that, and all those kinds of things? And the fallacy and the trouble with historical critical is that it puts it all into a certain time and place, and it sort of mutes the voice of the text to speak to us today. Historical critical is important to understand what it is saying, but it limits the conversation long ago, and then it just becomes an interesting thing about history and not something that has any present-day meaning. Another possibility, of course, with Revelation is futuristically, and a lot of that becomes allegorical when popular interpretation of Revelation is, oh, there's a beast coming out of the lake, and it's not a literal beast, but it stands for Bill Clinton or China. It was Russia when I was growing up on Trinity Broadcast Network. But that again, that falls into Revelation is a coded blueprint for how the world is going to end. And that is dangerous, because even if that impulse is right, and that is really what it is, I highly doubt that, and I don't think the literature supports that. I don't think you're taking Revelation at face value or honoring it for what it is. But even if that's what it is, even if I'm wrong, and that's exactly what it is, ain't none of us smart enough to decode what God has put in there. there have been many bright minds throughout history that have worked on that problem and solved it and missed. And so that's probably not it. How will we interpret it? Being Lutherans, we remember what Luther said, that Scripture is the cradle for the Christ child. It's the container that holds the living Word of God. And so we crack the Bible open and it holds Christ. It holds the Word for us. And a Lutheran hermeneutic, that's a big fancy seminary word for discipline of interpretation, the way that we interpret, has, and I'm following Book of Faith stuff from 20 years ago here. It's historical, it's literary, it's theological, it's devotional, and all of those matter. All of those are a piece of the puzzle, to use that word again. Historically, so what did this reading, what did this text mean when it was written? What did it mean to the author? What did it mean to the people who received it? Unless you've got that grounding, you're ripe for abuse. So what did it mean first to its first audience and to its first author? That's an important piece, but it's not the only piece. We also want to look at it as literature. What message does the medium convey? A song is a different genre than a toaster instruction booklet. When you pick up one, you are not looking for the other, right? When you want to put on music, it is because something is happening in your heart and your soul that someone reading the toaster oven manual is just not going to help. Similarly, when you break your toaster oven, don't call me over to come sing. Also not helpful, right? So the literature is different because it has different purposes, and as Marshall McLuhan talked about, the medium is the message. So we want to look at the medium because that's important to understanding the message. Revelation, we will notice, is completely over the top and mind-bending, and it leaves us dizzy. That's intentional. Because part of what Revelation's message is God is in charge and knows things and has powers that you, dear reader, do not. So you're supposed to be overwhelmed. And in fact, Revelation is the good news that what is overwhelming you as a Christian without nearly enough power in your life, who might die for being Christian, you who are overwhelmed by stress, the good news of Revelation is that the stress overwhelming you is itself overwhelmed by the God who loves you. So the medium conveys that, right? It takes your big problems and makes them look tiny compared to what God is up to. Of course, that leads us into the theological hermeneutic. What does this mean about God? What does this text have to teach us about who God is and what God's up to? And finally, the devotional, what does this mean for us? So we'll follow that outline, at least for today. Swig of coffee. On I go. Who wrote what to whom when? A man who identifies himself as John, not the apostle. Even Dionysius, that 3rd century bishop that said he couldn't understand Revelation. He, in the 3rd century, did a thorough grammatical analysis of the Greek of Revelation and of the Gospel of John and the letters of John, and came to the conclusion that there's absolutely no way these are written by the same people. It's just way too different. And so John, a prophet, a pastor, something, this person, John, is the author. What he writes is a letter. But he calls it an apocalypse, revelation. Apocalypse is the Greek word for revelation. So he writes it, but he writes it as a letter. Both of those forms were very common in his milieu, in his ancient world. There were all those letters that circulated throughout the empire. Paul and others wrote letters to churches all the time. So the Christian community was used to receiving letters from people who were far away, who were trying to encourage them or teach them or whatever. There was also a lot of apocalyptic literature, especially Jewish apocalyptic literature, more on that later, that was it was its own genre, kind of like sci-fi for us. It was its own, or vampire novels. It was its own thing. And so what John does is send that as a letter to the 7 churches in Asia, meaning Western Turkey, and he will identify each of those 7 and send a specific letter to each of them, and we'll talk about those in a couple weeks. Probably 95 or 96, he wrote this near the end of Domitian's 15-year reign as emperor of Rome. So what was going on? Well, there are still the memories of Nero, and several scholars have made the case that the number 666, which is the mark of the beast at the end of chapter 13 in Revelation, in Hebrew, you can add it up to Nero. Because, remember, Roman letters are also numerals, and so are Hebrew letters, actually. And either way, you can get to 666 with Nero's name. Well, that's interesting. But the memory of Nero was prominent in people's minds because in 64, of course, was the Great Fire of Rome. And who got blamed for that? The Jews. The Jews were blamed for the burning of Rome initially, but that did not stick. And so in his PR, Emperor Nero sort of pivoted and said, well, it wasn't actually the Jews, it was a sect of the Jews called the Christians who burned the city. So Christians were suspect because the Jews and Rome had come to a kind of uneasy agreement. The Jews, these sort of stubborn monotheists, refused to worship any of the Roman civic gods, including the emperor. And so they kind of came to finally to an uneasy peace together where they got an imperial exception because they promised not to pray to the emperor, but to pray for the emperor. And Rome made a sort of political decision that, okay, that's fine. Let them do their weird thing. They're not going to upset the peace, and so we'll just let them be delusional about the fact that the emperor is not God and let them have their way and it'll be fine. In part because the Jews had you know, a 2,000-year history, and were a fairly established religion and had been through all this stuff before, and they just were not going to change their minds, and Rome knew it, and so they made a compromise. Well, that certain Jews in Jerusalem stopped praying for the emperor and started creating trouble, and so Rome had to come in and crush that, and they did. So between 66 and 770, Rome sacked Jerusalem, razed the temple, and left a huge mess, which turned into a big fracture between Jewish and Roman relations. A lot of people scattered out of Jerusalem, fled to places like Asia, Western Turkey, and other places throughout the empire. And at this time, as there was an uneasy relationship between Rome and the Jews, there was a growing fracture between Jews and Christians. And so a lot of Jews were quick to point out to Rome that they were trying to appease. Those Christians aren't Jews. They're not like us. They worship some, you know, crucified criminal who's not really God, that's a totally different religion. They are no longer part of us. Well, that didn't sit well with the Christians, the Jewish Christians. And so you have all this fragmentation that happens between the Jews and the Christians, because the Christians were often scapegoated for things that the Jews were accused of. A lot of the Jews, when Rome would come and say, what are you doing? Do we need to bring you in? The Jews would go, no, we're not the problem, it's the Christians. And they're different than we are. And the Christians are, oh, wait a minute, no, we're part of the same movement here. All of that fracturing and all of those hurt feelings were swirling around at the end of the first century. At the same time, at the end, Emperor Domitian revived the Caesar cult and really liked, he was not a megalomaniac so much as he had some political acumen, not unlike Constantine later, who said, you know, Christianity is the official religion of the empire to unite the empire for political purposes, not because he was so Christian, most likely. Domitian saw the Caesar cult and emperor worship as a way to unify and unite the empire and keep everybody on the same page. And so it became much more in vogue and in style to have libations, offerings, public rituals, stand for the flag, kind of patriotic ritual worship of the emperor during Domitian's time. So that was escalating. The patriotic religious emperor worship and worship of other Roman civic gods was on the rise during Domitian's time. The Jews got their exception, but not the Christians, because they were different. And so, who was this new sort of branch off of Judaism that Judaism was increasingly rejecting? Well, they were a weird mystery religion that was just recently started. Read into that, it probably won't last. And it also doesn't have any history. The ancient world didn't trust things that were new. They trusted things that were old, a kind of a difference from today. The older and more established you were as a tradition, the more credibility you had. So these Christians, it was reported, would gather in homes and have private love feasts where they ate flesh and drank blood. So obviously they were sexual deviant cannibals. That's Eucharist from the outside. They also tended to be communities of people who were on the underside of society, social misfits. They welcomed slaves. They had female leadership. They did all kinds of things that flouted authority and undermined the social architecture that kept, society together. There was, society had a pretty solid, trustworthy social architecture, and Christians tended to attract the dangerous people on the underside, the poor, whom they fed and empowered. They touched their dead, spreading contagion. They did all kinds of, they had kind of the wrong people doing mysterious things, including showing love and respect and equality, that was just seen as dangerous. Furthermore, of course, they were unpatriotic atheists. They didn't believe in the gods. They wouldn't worship the gods. They would refuse to worship the gods in public. Instead, they were following some guy that Rome itself crucified. So, those were the Christians. As a result, of course, they were treated badly in society. Any of this sound familiar? Social exclusion, glass ceilings, petty harassments. And Christians were faced with daily choices like, well, I'm a carpenter. Do I join the carpentry guild? If I join the local carpentry guild, then I have to participate in all these public rituals and publicly worship the Roman gods. It's just part of the deal. If I don't join the guild, then I end up blacklisted and I lose an awful lot of business. And then I can't feed my family. What do? Do I join the guild and compromise my religious beliefs? Or do I hold fast, take my stand, and it really costs me? Anything from business and well-being and livelihood to, depending on who's calling me in and who I'm called in front of, various punishments up to and potentially including death. John himself was exiled and left to rot on his own on an island in Patmos. That was what happened to him. So those official punishments varied. It was not yet, in Domitian's time, there was not yet a program of systematic imperial punishment of Christians, but John was smelling the writing on the wall and seeing that as a very real possibility, the way things were moving. So that was all what was going on at that time. And so how is John going to address this situation? Well, he's going to write a pastoral letter to encourage the faith in his people. And it's a letter and not a sermon because he is exiled. He is on the island of Patmos, which I think it was Marlene said that she visited. And so she was very excited we were doing this because, and apparently it's a very small and very lovely island. And he was exiled there. And so he wrote a letter back to these 7 churches on his circuit in Western Turkey. 21:1, by the way, not 1:9. Let me give you these verses. I, John, your brother, who share with you in Jesus the persecution and the kingdom and the patient endurance was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. That's how he describes his situation. In 21:1, he says he sees a new heaven and a new earth coming down because the first heaven and the first earth had passed away and the sea was no more. That's an important detail because the sea is exactly what is keeping him away from his people. It is the barrier and that is dividing him from his community. So part of the joy at the end is the fact that God has removed the barrier and they can be together again. So a pastoral letter because he is exiled, that includes 7 letters because of a revealing, an apocalypse, a vision that he has. And he is called to share it. So he does. What cultural influences shape this? The Old Testament, John and his community were absolutely steeped in the Old Testament. There's probably over 500 allusions to the Old Testament. It's not just allusions. He never actually quotes it. He's not like Matthew who says, this was what happened to fulfill the prophecy here. He doesn't do that. It's more like a Disney filmmaker leaving Easter eggs all over the place. He talks about the temple. He talks about this. He talks about that. He uses a turn of phrase here or a word there that conjures up a whole Old Testament story. The tree of life, Garden of Eden, is planted in the new city. So there's all these allusions that are used. Obviously, the New Testament, his experience of Jesus, is part of that. Christian worship patterns, personal relationships in history with the people that he's writing to, because remember, it is still is a letter from a person to a community, to communities. Greco-Roman mythology and drama are part of this also. We'll get into that with chapter 12. But some of the plays and the stories of the time, that would be like me quoting Star Wars in a sermon. And then somebody 2,000 years later with no familiarity go, what's he talking about there? Well, I assume everybody knows what I'm talking about. I'm preaching to you. I'm not worried about what, 2,000 years later, people stumble across my sermon and start like analyzing it. I'm not thinking about that when I'm preaching it. But I guess my sermons aren't as interesting as Revelation either. So here we are. The other big heavy influence is Jewish apocalyptic literature, and let me give you a moment on that. Jewish apocalyptic literature was a thing. It was a genre. It was fairly popular. And the basic premise was that there was a heavenly unveiling of cosmic secrets by way of visions. So somebody was given a vision, which was wild and fantastic, and it was a pulling of the curtain back to see behind the curtain at the wizard's world, to see all of these amazing cosmic secrets. It was very dramatic. It was always over the top, big and intense, and it was generally dualistic. Good versus evil. God versus Satan. This side versus that side. And which side will you be on? And it was usually written to audiences that were on the losing side to convince them that they were on the winning side. Because the world had gone to hell in a handbasket, which meant to say that hell was winning. That's how it felt. That's how it feels. And so the apocalypse says, draws back the picture to say that God is in charge here. what the apocalypse does for us baseball fans is say, look, the Dodgers are winning 19-6. You happen to be living in an ugly 4-run inning of the 6. And it feels like we're losing. Look at the bigger picture here. We're not. Stay faithful. Don't jump ship. Don't start rooting for the other team. Don't remain faithful to God, who's got this in hand. But right now, it doesn't look like it or feel like it. So readers, disenfranchised, overwhelmed, people who are not in control, people who, you know, like for John's group, am I going to get arrested if I don't participate in this ritual because I'm a Christian? Is it okay for me to participate in this ritual or not? John would say no. But there are real consequences for that, and there's really not a whole lot of power to like change the system. And so readers feel completely overwhelmed. Apocalyptic literature is for them. It focuses on the future, and a concern for the future based on the crisis of the present. Lots of symbolism, with both single and multiple meanings. So some symbols actually just have one meaning. Some symbols have many meanings. You got to figure that all out. Some examples, there are a lot of animals and beasts, sometimes with human features. Part of the idea of that is simply to overwhelm you. Here is a dragon with a human face and 10 horns and 7 heads, and it's really ugly and powerful and a huge tail that can wipe out 500 people with one swish. Don't do an autopsy on the dragon. Understand that all of that it is a symbol for a big, ugly monster that is more powerful than you are. And it functions within a drama to be defeated by the God that is far more powerful than it. Numbers are prominently featured. 1, kind of the basic unity, and 7, the wholeness or completeness of God. That's why there are 7 days in a week. 6 is the number of humanity. It was created on the 6th day. It is near, but not exactly, God. So if you want to have a human being who is imitating and trying to be God, but is not able to do it, what would their number be? 666. A sort of anti-Trinity. The mark of the beast, right? 4 is the number of creation, the 4 winds, the 4 directions, the 4 elements. 3 sometimes in there, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 12 is the number of God's people, the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles, the 12 walls of the city of Jerusalem. 1,000 is a number that's used that means a lot. 144,000 is a number that will come up. That's 12 times 1,000. That's not an actual head count. James Helgauger didn't stand in the back and figure out, exactly 144,000 people. No, it's shorthand for all of God's people. The Old Testament people, the New Testament people, and thousands upon thousands of them. Colors are part of this too: white, red, black, pale. And so if you want a little more background for this, and especially background for Revelation, I would suggest go back and read Daniel 7. Don't worry about understanding it. Just read it and get a feel and a flavor. Theology, finally, God is sovereign, eternal, and praiseworthy. That's important. God's the big one in charge. Christ crucified and risen is the omnipotent Lord, because God has elevated Christ to be the ruler and the judge of all things. Another theme is that evil imitates God, as I talked about with 666. And evil is nasty and strong and real. Apocalyptic literature is written to people who are suffering, and it does not minimize their suffering. It reframes it. It gives hope, but it doesn't say, it's nothing. Oh, it is something, and it's real, and it's a fight. But God will win, and God will judge, and so remain faithful. And Revelation's particular contribution is that death itself is victory. So when evil kills you for being faithful, you win. That makes you a witness, or in Greek, a martyr. And so death is life because of what Christ has done. You don't have to be afraid of it. What you might actually have to be afraid of is survival, because of the compromise that you have to do to achieve it. Within all of this, the theology of Revelation says that God is guiding history somewhere worth all the loss and the trouble of getting there. And we'll get to that vision at the end. But the goal of all of that is a just reconciliation of all things. So what does this mean for us? Think about these questions as we go through the summer. What does this mean for us? What false gods vie for our loyalty, including our ultimate loyalty? If you're going to lose business because you're a Christian, what do you do? Who is God? The almighty dollar or the almighty God? Revelation challenges us on that. What fears tempt us away from faith? How does God's future shape our present? That's a really important question. Part of what Revelation is trying to do is to show you the end of the movie so that you can live where you are right now, so that we can orient our present to God's inevitable future. If, in fact, all of history is moving toward the heavenly city with the healing of the nations, where there are no liars, thieves, or crooks and scoundrels, well, what does that mean about how we deal with liars, thieves, scoundrels, and crooks today? How do we respond to the world around us? So, out of all of that, and I thank you for patiently listening, because I went on and on and on, as I am wont to do. If you're an overachiever, a perfectionist, really super interested, a nerd, or just bored at home this week, here is your huge homework assignment. Read Daniel 7. Then I want you to read the entire book of Revelation in one sitting, so you get it as a one whole novel sweep. And if you can, read it aloud, because that is how it was read to be. It was read to be heard, not to be read. John wrote it for one person to read to a gathered assembly pre-COVID, so that people could hear it. Remember the radio earlier. So I invite you to sit there at home. This took me about an hour this week when I did it. Read the whole book in one sitting aloud. And then after that, go back and reread chapter 1, because that's what we'll talk about next week. If, however, you are an average student, you're only slightly curious, you're uninterested, but you're nervous that you'll get called on and have nothing to say, or you're a procrastinator feeling tired or lazy or busy this week, then just read chapter 1. If those are your invitations. If something else is going on with you, then you make your own choice. Let's stop that and go back to this. Questions, thoughts, reflections, reactions. I hope to have a whole lot more conversation and interaction in the weeks to come, but I wanted to lay out the groundwork and the landscape today. So that's thus the whole sort of slideshow and lecture format. Thoughts, reactions, questions, protests. Stephanie.
Will there be any sort of notes made available?
Yeah, I will do the I'll do the PowerPoint. I'll make that available.
Great, thank you.
How will we have access to that?
That's a great question. It'll come out in eWeek, I think. I'm hoping that we can put it on the website. I would ask your prayers for Han, because he's been in and out of the hospital for a couple of weeks, and so that has yeah, he's got some sort of mysterious blood clot that is flummoxing his doctors. He's been tested for COVID. It's not that, but he's got something else going on, and it's been just nasty. And so keep him in your prayers. And then please be patient on the technical side with us, because you know, things are hit and miss with that. But I'll make them available one way or another and let you know how. So hopefully on the website and through eWeek. Is that just all too much? It gets more fun when we dive into it, but that gives you at least the sort of the macro, the big picture, the eye in the sky overview of it, and we'll dive in the next few weeks.
I'm glad to hear that they've kind of settled on that. It wasn't St. John that wrote it. That idea seemed to die fairly hard. You know,
It does.
off and on throughout my life, but it was St. John. But I'm glad they finally settled it.
Yeah. No, and there are still some people who think it was St. John, but it most likely was not. There's just too much evidence. And if the bishop in the 3rd century who couldn't understand the book was able to conclusively say, no, it wasn't that guy, I think that tells us something.
I thought it was a great overview, Pastor. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I'll stress one more time, as you read it this week, and I hope you really do read it out loud. Don't get hung up on details, and don't get hung up on plot. Like as if it were, you know, a linear thing, because it is not linear. It is. If you've ever listened to a 7-year-old tell a story, and you know you have to sort of suspend chronology, it's in there, but not always. That's how you got to read Revelation.
It'll be easy for me then.
I'm really looking forward to Murray leading this next week. Last call for thoughts, questions, etc. All right. Blessed Father's Day, and hope to see you next week. Chapter 1. We'll get in kind of deep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Pastor, I have to tell you some good news today.
Oh, good.
Because of the release, visitors can now go to nursing homes and on down boarding cares, and with restrictions on, of course. But Paul meets after he comes home from the doctor's appointment. We have one on Tuesday. He's coming home for a visit, and then during the week he'll be able to come and go as he wishes, which is used to be about 3 or 4 or 5 days a week. So
Wow.
yeah,
That's
it's
good.
just wonderful.
Finally.
Real nice change.
Thanks be to God.
That's great news.
Yay.
Yeah,
Thank you for
thank
sharing
you.
that.
Mhm. I know.
Bye.
Bye.
I got to figure out how to get out of here.
There's a red end button somewhere.
Well, I don't see one. I have to go
Lower
around
right.
the exterior.
Leave. Okay, here we go.
Here, I can end it for everybody.
Wait a
We'll
minute.
do
Yeah,
that.
okay.